We cannot say that they didn't warn us. We begin today with the words of those who, at critical moments in Donald Trump's first presidency, pushed back against Donald Trump's wishes to use the military any way he wanted.
When he would tell me that he wanted to do something, 100% of the time I checked with the White House counsel, because oftentimes he wouldn't have the authority to do what he wanted to do.
I had to explain to him, we can't do that. It would violate international law. It would be terrible for our neighbors to the south.
It would violate international law. It would be terrible. Quote, he didn't have the authority to do the things he wanted to do. Those comments were jarring at the time, and now they serve as a canary in the coal mine for where we find ourselves today, right now, in the aftermath of extraordinary reporting that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered the military to leave no survivors on a strike against boats in the Caribbean. Donald Trump and the Trump administration begin the week on the defensive after the Washington Post was the first to report that Pete Hegseth ordered everyone on the boat killed, according to two people with direct knowledge of the operation. A follow-up strike was conducted when it became clear that there were two survivors from the initial strike. Both of them were reportedly killed in that second strike. The Washington Post adds that SEAL Team 6 led that attack. Based on what we know from their reporting, it is, by the accounts of lawyers and lawmakers from both parties and experts and everyone who has weighed in publicly, likely illegal. A group of former military leaders and lawyers known as the former JAGS Working Group, they write this in a statement, quote, not only does international law prohibit targeting these survivors, but it also requires the attacking force to protect, to rescue, and if applicable, to treat them as prisoners of war. Violations of these obligations are war crimes, murder, or both. There are no other options, end quote. The black and white nature of what legal experts say the law says about the strikes are unavoidable, even for Republicans, even in the time of Trump. Here's the head of the House Armed Services Committee, Republican Mike Turner.
Obviously, if that occurred, that would be very serious, and I agree that would be an illegal act. That is not the legal opinion or the information or the legal justification. The acts that have been described to Congress that are being undertaken in this, there are very serious concerns in Congress about the attacks on the so-called drug boats down in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and the legal justification that's been provided.
So-called attacks on drug boats, because the evidence hasn't been made clear to the public, or it would appear the Congress. The Senate Armed Services Committee also announcing an investigation promising, quote, vigorous oversight, end quote. And again, that is news in and of itself. There's been nothing vigorous in the category of oversight for the last 11 months. For his part, Secretary Hegseth initially called the Washington Post reporting, quote, fabricated, inflammatory, and derogatory, end quote, while at the same time publicly defending the decision to strike the boats in the Caribbean. He then posted a meme, a parody of a children's book character, Franklin the Turtle. His boss has had a different response. He has publicly sounded much more circumspect, if you can use that word to describe Trump, in his defense of alleged war crimes. Here's Donald Trump yesterday.
I don't know anything about it. He said he did not say that, and I believe him.
If there were a second strike that killed wounded people wounded in the first strike, are you thinking
number one,
that would be legal?
Number one, I don't know that happened. And Pete said he did not want them. He didn't even know what people were talking about. So we'll look into it. But no, I wouldn't have wanted that. Not a second strike.
I wouldn't have wanted that. Not a second strike. I wouldn't have wanted that. The news of the second strike puts the video that was made by those 6 Democrats who simply urged members of the military, men and women in the military, to not follow any order that is illegal. And Donald Trump's and Pete Hegseth's and the administration's insane, hyperbolic, furious backlash to that simple message in that video. We have to look at that differently now, right? Here's one of the 6 Democrats who appear in that video, who's now under investigation by the Pentagon, Senator Mark Kelly.
Based on what CNN is reporting, what the Washington Post is reporting, do you believe if there was a second strike to eliminate any survivors, that constitutes a war crime?
It seems to. If that is true, if what has been reported is accurate, I've got serious concerns about anybody in that chain of command stepping over a line that they should never step over. We are not Russia. We're not Iraq. We hold ourselves to a very high standard of professionalism. And this is where I'm really troubled about this, is because I have so much respect for people in the United States Navy. I served in the Navy for 25 years, and there is no organization more professional than Navy SEALs. And they should be revered. And that's why I say I hope what I've heard about this strike is not accurate.
You mentioned that you were a captain in the Navy. If you received that order, would you have carried it out?
No.
He would not have carried it out. It is an inflection point for the U.S. military. It is an inflection point for the country. It is an inflection point for the Trump White House. We'll show you how they're dealing with it today. And all of it comes in the wake of news reporting of alleged war crimes. Crimes being carried out by the Trump administration. It's where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling is with us. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. Retired Rear Admiral Bill Baumgartner is here. He's the former commander of the 7th Coast Guard District and also served as the chief counsel of the United States Coast Guard. He's now a member of the former Judge Advocates General, the JAGS working group, who released the letter we just quoted from. Also joining us, political analyst Claire McCaskill. She served on the Armed Services Committee while in the Senate. An incredibly serious and solemn news cycle, and I'm honored to have all 3 of you here with me. Let's just take this as it faced public. So what the public first heard, and I understand that may be different. It's definitely different from what happened inside the military. And it may even be different as I sit and reflect on it from what the 6 members of Congress, the senators and House members who made that video knew. But when Ellen Nakashima and Alex Horton of the Washington Post posted this story, you could almost feel the tectonic plates shift. And I just want to read the first couple paragraphs to what the country, what the public, what the world first knew about this. Pete Hegseth ordered on first Caribbean boat strike, officials say, quote, kill them all. Quote, as 2 men clung to a stricken, burning ship targeted by SEAL Team 6, the Joint Special Operations Commander followed the Defense Secretary's order to leave no survivors. The longer the U.S. surveillance aircraft followed the boat, the more confident intelligence analysts watching from command centers became that the 11 people on board were ferrying drugs. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a spoken directive, according to 2 people with direct knowledge of the operation. Quote, the order was to kill everyone, one of them said. The Post goes on to detail the operation, and I'll get to that. But I want to stop here and ask you, Admiral Baumgartner, just if you can just illuminate if that much of it rings true to you, that when you are carrying out a military strike, there are eyes on it. And that's how a president or any policymaker can visit the tank and watch the operation in real time if it's vital or imperative. But for anyone doing any sort of oversight in Congress when they decide to have that role, or within the agencies, intelligence and military, that many people at least always have eyes on an operation and ears on the chain of command.
That would be true. There are going to be a number of people that are watching it and monitoring it in real time. In fact, that's normally what makes our operations successful, because we do have that kind of command and control and monitoring. So that would happen in this particular case. It is kind of interesting here. It makes it sound like it was just unexpected that there would be survivors. And what that tells me is this was a tremendous failure in planning. The military has a great planning system, and you look at what are possible contingencies. It's almost inconceivable to me that a good planning system wouldn't have said, what if we don't kill everybody on the first strike? What do we do with the survivors? What are our legal responsibilities? What resources do we have to take care of those survivors? So some parts of this don't ring true to me, that they weren't prepared for that. They should have been prepared.
And the Washington Post, the first paragraph makes clear that the two sources that the Washington Post said have, quote, direct knowledge of the operation. I'll read it one more time. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a spoken directive suggesting that he was somehow on this live feed. Quote, the order was to kill everybody. Would a defense secretary be monitoring something like this? Is that something that could or would happen? Especially this one was allegedly at the beginning of September. And would he have the ability to give that kind of order?
It's certainly something that he could have been watching, and he does have the ability to give that type of an order. It really shouldn't happen that way, because these things should be planned. They should be thought through. You should have legal advice. You shouldn't have to be doing something like that. But that kind of does fit with what we've seen happen with our military over the last 9 months. We've seen many of our leaders replaced. We saw the judge advocate generals of our services dismissed. And we've seen a greater politicization of the whole process. So it does make it seem much more likely to me that we would have that kind of ad hoc intervention in the middle of an operation.